Alright guys, I am going to do a demo on, let's see. Alright everyone, I am going to do a demo on wet into wet with acrylic and using that as a way to tone your canvas. So let's go over the tools real quick. I just have a variety of my acrylic brushes out. Now remember, you want to have brushes that are for acrylic, and then if you're using oil, separate brushes that you're using just for the oil. You don't want to mix the two. Okay, those mediums are not compatible. I have my water out. I have, in this case I'm just using a little plastic lid as my palette, but you could use your palette paper. Particularly if you're using a bunch of colors, you want to mix colors, get out a sheet of your palette paper, have a glass palette out for yourself. Okay, and then I have a paper towel, which I'll use if I need to dab anything. And then of course I have my acrylics. I have some thicker bodied acrylics, golden, and then I just have a Blick brand. And then I also have these liquid acrylics, which I want to show you and how wonderful they are for wet into wet. So let's begin. So wet into wet, first you're wetting the surface. Okay, so I'm wetting part of my surface. Now you don't have to wet the entire thing all at once because you parts of it might dry and then it's not really going to work as much, so you can kind of work on different sections at a time. Or if you're going to do it fast, you could wet the entire thing. Now let's put out, I'm going to put out a little bit of my blue. Okay, and before I try to take this acrylic, which is, it's a thicker body acrylic, especially in comparison to this, which is a very liquid acrylic, I need to water this down. So I'm going to take one of my brushes and begin to get that more liquid and fluid. Okay. And then with wet into wet, what you start to do is you can then tap this onto the surface and it's going to start to disperse. Now different pigments will disperse differently. So for example, here's some of the ultramarine blue, and you can also sort of take this out. And if you want something to disperse more into these little kind of flary bits, you're going to add more water. Okay, so if you're putting it down, the pigment isn't really moving, it means add more water to your mixture if you want this kind of ink blot effect. Now what gets really exciting is when you also start to blend different colors together. Then of course if you don't like something, you can kind of dab it away a bit. You just want to make sure you're doing that while it's still wet. And then obviously if the acrylic, if that dries, that's going to, you can't manipulate that any longer, so you'll just have to paint over it. Okay, so we're going to put down some of this quinacridone magenta, and we will see if this pigment disperses differently from the ultramarine blue. Okay, so again, it's a thicker acrylic. I need to water it down before I try to do a wet into wet technique. Okay, so I'm getting that nice and liquidy on my brush, and then putting it right into the water and adding more water as it wants. So this, you can create this kind of almost like tie-dye effect. You can layer other colors on top of each other. The pink, this quinacridone magenta disperses a little bit more readily than some of the other colors. You can start to really see that as we add more water. So it disperses more than the blue, I would say, than the ultramarine blue. So as you start this, as you're experimenting, you're going to notice that different colors react differently. So some colors will more readily disperse with the water. Okay, so you can start to layer colors together. You can get these kind of ink washes, blends glowing. You could smooth this out entirely if you wanted to, but I think the kind of benefit of wet into wet is this interesting kind of ink block texture. You can also take, say, like a smaller round brush like this, and you could start to draw out a design in water. Right, so say you have a part of your painting that you want to have almost this kind of watercolor, wet into wet, ink blot effect. So maybe the tail of something or just some sort of design. It could even be a background design. You could first draw out that design in water. Then you can go and get your pigment, and again, make sure it's liquidy. You can start to tap that pigment down. And what's interesting about this is these colors will only disperse basically to where that water is, right? So you can keep adding water, but it's going to kind of stay within the design that you've mapped out in water. It's not going to branch out into dry canvas. So this can be a really interesting way of creating these designs. Okay, and again, if it's not dispersing, that just means add more water, and you might have to be adding more water than you would really think. So you can see on my brush there's even this big droplet of water that I'm dropping down. That's going to help that pigment move around. Okay. And then again, it can be really fun to go back into an area like this, for example, which is really wet and has that quinacridone magenta there, and I can layer another color on top of that. Okay, so you can definitely do wet into wet with these thicker bodied acrylics. Oh, and before I move on, let me show you. You can also kind of manipulate your design further. Right, so you can drag this paint out and create these beautiful patterns. And if I want to tap more pigment down, I definitely can. And that pigment is going to follow these sort of water pathways that you have set up. Obviously, if you start painting into a dry area, of course it's going to go there. But if you're just placing pigment down like this and trying to get it to move around, it's going to stay within the areas that are wet. Okay, so that can be an interesting way of creating designs. So this was a heavier bodied acrylic that we watered down. Now let's test out, let's add a little bit more water. I'm going to add a little bit more water to this area, so re-wet it. So with wet into wet, you want to make sure the area that you're putting this down onto is already wet, so you're wetting your canvas beforehand. That's what's going to allow that pigment to kind of move around. Now I'm going to put down some of this golden cadmium red medium hue fluid acrylic. And you're already going to see that it looks really different from the other acrylic. It's already very liquidy. Okay, still going to wet my brush a little bit. Now this is great because it's already very liquidy, but it's really highly pigmented. And it just disperses a little bit more readily. And it's going to stay more pigmented than a heavy-bodied acrylic would that you're watering down. So it's both fluid and highly chromatic and pigmented. Okay. let's try getting a bigger brush too. So that was using a small round brush. I'm going to get this larger flat brush, wet that, get a bunch of this pigment on here, wet it again. Let's tap that down. Okay. So the fluid acrylics move really well with this technique. They move into the water really well. Alright, let's try another fluid acrylic. So I have this green gold. And just shake it a little bit beforehand. Okay. Alright. All these colors are going to start to blend together. Just fine. Okay, so look at how pigmented that is. That is the benefit of getting some of these liquid or fluid acrylics, is they're gonna keep their chroma and still be very easy to manipulate with this wet into wet technique, and being able to get them really thin but still fairly chromatic. Okay, and try some of our other acrylics on top of this, or quinacridone. So see how this heavier bodied acrylic just doesn't move as well? You can still do it, it's just if you get really into this technique of working wet into wet, you'll probably want to get some liquid acrylics or fluid acrylics. Okay, so we've talked about layering different colors, trying designs, trying these different acrylics. Now you'll just want to make sure that if you're toning a canvas, that we're kind of covering that white, right? So let's get more of this canvas covered. I'm just going to start wetting the rest of it. And I'll even just go in with my larger brush and start putting in color and value throughout the entire composition. You can even go on top with a wet brush and drag parts of this out. That can be really interesting. Okay, so you can also use this to create a really interesting ground to be painting on top of. So maybe you want to try painting on top of a ground that has all of these different colors in it together, right, versus just the standard toning it to burnt umber or toning it a mid-tone gray. You can try something that has all of these different colors within it, and then you could even let parts of this colorful, interesting sort of ink blotty ground come through your painting. So I'm just trying to cover most of the white at this point. And get some of the blue and go up here. And I'm even on my brush, my palette is obviously very messy now, but I can get blue on part of my brush on this side and then more of this red on the other and see what happens. Or I'm getting these different colors coming through. So wet into wet is a good opportunity to try playing with your paint a bit. Okay, so now you could let it dry like this. You could also try tipping it. That's going to do different things with the paint. If you like it at some point, you can tip it, stop, let it dry flat like that if you like this design. Then you could also go in, if you want to, go in with more of a clean brush, and you could manipulate parts of the paint too, or take some paint away. Okay. So use this as an opportunity to experiment. So try tipping your canvas. I would say the best thing though is trying not to completely smooth everything out and just make it an even tone. You can do that, but that's just kind of toning your canvas in a regular way. If you really want to try wet into wet and trying these different colors together, less is more. So put the paint down, let the water do the work of kind of mixing your colors together and getting these intriguing patterns. Don't try to blend everything out. Okay guys, so that's a quick demo on wet into wet, and there will be more demos coming up on these various techniques. Alright, I finished my last little video, but then realized I had one more thing I wanted to show with the wet into wet, which is dropping pigment down directly from the bottle into a wet surface, and this would be for the fluid acrylics. It doesn't have to be that golden brand, but they do need to be a liquid fluid acrylic like this. So not a heavy bodied acrylic. It's not really going to work with those acrylics. So I'm going to wet part of my surface. I'm going to get it nice and wet so that pigment can really move around. And then I'm going to try several different pigments and we'll see if these pigments disperse differently. So, with a little bit of quinacridone magenta. I can get a bit of what that is. Okay, here we go. Okay. Alright, so quinacridone magenta, it really disperses really well. I'm not sure why exactly different pigments do that, but some of the blues, for example, don't really disperse all that well on their own. You kind of have to go in and manipulate them, but quinacridone magenta tends to really expand. So let's also try some of the cadmium red. So you can see this doesn't really disperse as much as the quinacridone magenta. So if we want to get that to move around more, we have to add more water. So you can also go on top and drop droplets of water and make it move around. Okay, let's also try the green gold. Oops. Okay. That's fine. This one is also dispersing really nicely. You can layer them on top of one another. So this would be if you wanted to get super chromatic, you can drop the pigment down directly. And get a really interesting effect. And going from different distances is going to have different effects. Let's add more water on this surface. Kind of help those pigments move around more. Let's see if we can get more of this magenta to come out. You can tell I like this color. So this is another interesting thing to try, is dropping down the pigments. You can also see that because of the way that this pigment was coming out of the bottle, it's created these flecks. So you can also even do something like, let's put some of, I have another fluid acrylic, it's the yellow oxide. I'm going to put a little bit of this down. And I'm going to get it on one of my flat brushes, and I'm going to flick pigment onto the surface. So that can be another interesting effect too. Let's try another color. Let's get, I'm going to try to get more of this magenta out. I don't think it's meant to be. Okay, let's try the cadmium. Okay, let's try flicking that. Okay, so those are two other techniques. If you like what's happening, then remember you want to let it dry flat like this, and it might disperse some of the patterns that are coming up, but it's going to keep. You can see some of the pattern I had gotten before that's stayed. Alright guys, so there's a couple more techniques with wet into wet.